Two tracks to preventing or escalating a trade war between the United States and China. Complaints before the World Trade Organization, behind-the-scenes negotiations, while consumers around the world watch for rising prices on food, travel, and medicine. Still searching for answers in that nerve agent attack in England. The UN and the Global Chemical Weapons Watchdog are both meeting on the issue, and we're hearing for the first time from the daughter of the Russian ex-spy as they recover from their poisoning.
Live from Washington, this is The World Today.
Hello and thanks for joining us. I'm Elaine Reyes in Washington, D.C. We begin with a face-off between China and the United States over tariffs, each expressing its determination to impose billions in penalties while leaving a window of opportunity for negotiations. China has officially launched a challenge with the World Trade Organization on the latest round of proposed U.S. tariffs. CGTN's Nathan King reports the big question is, will the two sides be able to come to an agreement and avoid a trade war?
Well, now that the U.S. has proposed its list of tariffs and China rapidly responded, the multi-billion-dollar question here is, can a trade war be avoided? And these tariffs are not being applied now. This is something that U.S. officials are now stressing more and more, that there is potentially room for a negotiated solution.
Technically, both countries have just proposed tariffs. There's been nothing enacted. And I think that's an important point. And here in the U.S., we're going to put it out for comment for a couple months. So I don't want to pinpoint a deadline.
The U.S. and China does have time to talk. We drew up a tariff timeline for you to see what exactly is going on here. There's a public consultation period here in the U.S. for the U.S. tariffs on China up until May 22nd. That's when they hear from businesses and consumer groups. Then the U.S. has about 180 days or more to decide on whether to impose those tariffs. That's potentially 6 months. Now that China has also lodged a formal complaint over the latest round of tariff proposals from the U.S. and the World Trade Organization, there's 60 days of consultations as well before the complaint can be moved forward as well. So there is time to talk. But a breakthrough would probably likely come, wouldn't it, between high-level discussions. We all know that there have been discussions between the U.S. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin and his counterpart Liu He in China. There's even talk of Steve Mnuchin making a trip to Beijing. We'll have to wait and see how that pans out as well. And other levels of discussions may also come in. Meanwhile, businesses, U.S. businesses based in China, are hoping for a quick conclusion.
What I'm hoping is that the two sides will get together and negotiate in good faith and resolve this before any of these tariffs are actually enacted.
It's not just U.S. multinationals that do business in China. It's a lot of U.S. lawmakers here. We've actually had U.S. senators pressing the White House Thursday over their constituents' concern if China retaliates, especially in the agricultural heartland. So the White House very much feeling the pressure domestically as well as internationally. The big question is, what is the White House's endgame here? Remember, U.S. President Trump really fixates on the trade deficit of about $375 billion between China and the U.S. Others in his administration want a long-term shake-up of the economic architecture between China and the U.S. when it comes to investment, technology transfer, and the like. It's going to be interesting to see whether the U.S. president settles for something smaller or that his advisors are pushing for something bigger. And of course, in any negotiation, China has its own concerns and wants to. Nathan King, CGTN, at the White House.
Europe is closely watching the escalating China-U.S. trade tensions, urging caution and calm. CGTN's Kevin Ozebek is live for us in Brussels. So, Kevin, what has the EU's response been so far?
Well, the official EU response here is that any trade dispute should all be hammered out within the framework of the World Trade Organization. That's a very diplomatic answer there, and that's because this is a very interesting position for the EU to be in, because as the U.S. and China battle this out. This is a battle between the EU's two biggest trading partners. Just take a look at this graph and take a look at these numbers. When you look at EU total trade, so total trade is the combination of both imports and exports. China and the U.S. make up together about a third of EU total trade. The U.S. is the EU's largest trading partner, making up about 17% of total EU trade. China is right behind there, making up about 15% of EU total trade. What's also very interesting here is the EU has similarities with both of these two. First off, let's start off with China. Both the EU and China want to be champions right now of free trade. They think that's going to be the economic engine that really revs growth all around the world, and they want to counter some of the more protectionist power figures that are popping up around the world, like a U.S. President Donald Trump. But at the same time, the EU is also with the U.S. that both of them believe China is engaging in unfair trading practices. In fact, the EU has its own very steep tariffs already in place against Chinese steel imports. Also, there's a new report out just today from the Brussels-based organization called Euroactiv. According to Euroactiv, the European Commission is considering starting to file its own complaints against China at the WTO, and that's because both EU leaders as well as many European business investors and business heads think European firms have a very unfair advantage when it comes to how they have to operate in China. They have to enter into partnerships with local firms, and then those local Chinese firms can suck up their intellectual property. So really, the EU is standing back, watching all of this, and is waiting to see how this is going to unfold.
All right, Kevin Ozbek live for us in Brussels. Thank you. China and Russia hailing their strengthened relationship. The two countries showed their commitment to each other during the Chinese foreign minister's visit to Moscow. Wang Yi met his Russian counterpart and President Vladimir Putin. CGTN's Jack Perrick reports from Moscow.
China and Russia during Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi's visit here to Moscow was that they are strong friends. Russian President Vladimir Putin hailing the relationship as at an unprecedentedly high level. Now, the two sides came to talk about Syria and Afghanistan. They say they're on the same page mostly on those issues, but they also wanted to talk about the DPRK ahead of a summit of the two countries on the Korean Peninsula. Essentially, China and Russia want the same thing with this. They want to press Pyongyang to wind down its nuclear program while encouraging South Korea, the Republic of Korea, to stop its military drills that are backed by the United States. We also heard from Wang Yi during this visit complain and say that he was completely against the U.S. tariffs that have been proposed on Chinese steel products, saying that Russia and China understand one another when it comes to the global trade order. Separately to this, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, spoke out strongly about the Skripal case. Russia is incensed by the fact that the OPCW, the chemical weapons organization in The Hague, Russia was outvoted in its attempt to get a joint investigation into the Salisbury nerve agent attack. Take a look at what Sergei Lavrov had to say.
We have said more than once that we will accept the results of any investigation in which we have equal participation, which is transparent and based on procedures documented in the Convention on the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, and which is not secret, as our British colleagues are trying to act in relation to the investigation of the Skripal case.
And in another twist on that story, Yulia Skripal, the 33-year-old daughter of the former Russian spy Sergei Skripal, released her first public statement saying that she's feeling well and that she's improving and that she'd like to thank everybody for their kind words and for those who came to her aid in the wake of the nerve agent attack. Jack Perrick, CGTN, Moscow.
The UN Security Council just opened a meeting on that ex-spy poisoning. Russia's UN ambassador called for the session. On Wednesday, Russia lost a motion to join the investigation by the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. Britain says its own investigation found the nerve agent used was developed by the Soviet military. Moscow denies any involvement. In South Korea, it's decision time for former President Park Geun-hye. She will receive the verdict Friday on several corruption charges. The South Korean court will allow a rare live broadcast of the verdict on national television. Prosecutors are seeking a 30-year jail term for the influence peddling scandal that rocked the nation in 2016. Among the key charges she's facing is colluding with a friend to make tens of millions of dollars in bribes. Mexico's Senate has rebuked President Donald Trump over his plan to deploy National Guard troops on the U.S. Mexico border. Trump said he signed that proclamation to fight illegal immigration, but Mexican lawmakers say it's just the latest insult in a growing border battle. CGTN's Frank Contreras reports from Mexico City.
In response to U.S. President Donald Trump's decision to send National Guard troops to the U.S. Mexico border, the Mexican Senate has joined forces, all political parties there in a presidential election year, unifying their voices and calling on the Mexican government to stop all cooperation with the United States if the U.S. continues the militarization of the border. The Mexican Senate calling on the President of Mexico, Enrique Peña Nieto, to stop cooperation on key issues of immigration and border security if that military buildup continues. The Mexican government is very clear. This has happened several times in the recent past under Barack Obama's presidency, and before that under George W. Bush. It usually happens around midterm election time. Meantime, that caravan of immigrants from Central America that triggered all this debate is making its way now through the central Mexican state of Puebla. They're aboard buses. The caravan has been largely disbanded. They're mostly poor people fleeing political violence. They're fleeing gang violence as well inside their home nation. Frank Contreras, CGTN, Mexico City.
China has launched a massive live fire drill in the South China Sea. It includes some 40 ships from several fleets, and for the first time in a live fire drill, China's aircraft carrier. This coincides with exercises by 3 U.S. aircraft carriers in the same area. The Chinese Navy has conducted a series of air and sea exercises recently in the South China Sea and in the Western Pacific. China also deployed a new fleet off the Horn of Africa for anti-piracy escort duty. Millions in China are marking the traditional festival of Qingming, or Tomb Sweeping Day. People visit the graves of their ancestors and relatives to pay their respects. Customs include burning incense and joss paper, bringing offerings, and praying. Qingming is a 3-day national holiday, and many in China are taking advantage of the holiday to travel. Traffic during this period is expected to grow by 4% this year. Thursday is the travel peak, with the return peak falling on Saturday. And that is the world today. Thanks so much for watching. I'm Elaine Reyes. World Insight is coming your way next.